A dream ignites. Shaquille O'Neal stood on the balcony of his luxurious penthouse, a place that offered a panoramic view of the city he had grown to love. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the skyline, turning the glass towers into silhouettes and stretching long shadows over the bustling streets below. The view was breathtaking, a testament to all that he had achieved. It was the kind of vista that made him think of where he started, how far he had come from a childhood filled with poverty, limited resources, and a near-constant fight for acceptance. Shaquille had earned everything in his life through sheer will and determination. From his early days on the basketball courts of Newark to becoming an NBA legend, his journey had not been easy. He had faced adversity at every step, both on and off the court. Yet, despite the fame, fortune, and accolades, there was always a yearning for something more, a purpose greater than the game, something that transcended the ball and the spotlight. This evening, standing on the balcony and gazing out at the city, he was reflecting on an idea that had been growing in his mind over the past few weeks. It was a dream that would change everything for him. Shaquille had always been driven by the idea of freedom. Freedom to explore new opportunities, to reach the communities and causes that needed help, to expand his business empire, and most importantly, to fuel his philanthropy. He thought back to a recent trip he had made to a remote school in the Midwest. He had been invited to speak to a group of students who struggled with poverty, inadequate resources, and limited futures. The experience had been life-changing. The children he had met were filled with so much potential, so much curiosity and determination, but their circumstances held them back. He remembered how their eyes lit up when he told them about his journey and how much they hungered for a different future. That visit had ignited something inside him. During the flight back, cramped in a commercial airplane, Shaquille's thoughts had wandered. It wasn't about the luxury of owning a private jet or the vanity of flying in first class. It was about something much deeper. What if he could use a private jet to reach more of these communities? What if he could travel to remote areas, bring resources, support, and hope to those who needed it most? What if this jet could be the bridge to a larger mission, one that involved breaking barriers and changing lives? The idea consumed him. Owning a private jet wasn't about status. It was about access to places that commercial flights couldn't take him. It was about being able to show up at a school in rural America, a charity event in a faraway city, or a community in need of support, without the constraints of commercial schedules. This jet, he thought, could be the vehicle to take his vision to the next level. He had already started making plans, working closely with his business advisor and friend, Mark, who had always been there to offer counsel and guidance. Shaquille trusted him implicitly, and over the course of several conversations, they had begun discussing what kind of aircraft would meet his needs. This was a big investment, and Shaquille didn't take decisions like this lightly. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw Mark's name flashing on the screen. With a slight smile, he answered, "Shaq, you there?" Mark's voice crackled through the phone, as upbeat as ever. "Yeah, I'm here. Just thinking," Shaquille replied, his voice steady, though a touch pensive. "I can tell," Mark said with a chuckle. "So, are we doing this? Is the jet happening?" Shaquille hesitated for a moment, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, as if the answer could be found there. "I think I am. I mean, it's not just about me, Mark. It's about what this can do for others. I'm not just thinking about luxury. This jet could be a tool to help me do even more for the communities I care about." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Shaquille could almost hear Mark nodding in approval. "I get it," Mark said thoughtfully. "You know how I feel about this. But you need to be sure, Shaq. It's not just the price tag. It's the responsibility. People are going to talk. They always do." Shaquille sighed, the weight of Mark's words sinking in. "Yeah, I know. But if I let fear and criticism dictate my decisions, then I'd never do anything. I've made it this far by staying true to my purpose, and that's not going to change." People will talk, but if this jet helps me get to places I couldn't otherwise reach, then it's worth it." There was a beat of silence before Mark responded, his voice filled with respect. "That's what I like to hear. All right, I'll start pulling some options for you. Let's get this process going." The excitement that Shaquille had been feeling before his conversation with Mark came rushing back. This was it. This was the next step in his journey. He felt a sense of pride, knowing that he was about to make a purchase that would allow him to make an even bigger impact. In the following weeks, Shaquille threw himself into the process of selecting the right jet. He visited hangars, met with manufacturers, and delved into the technical specifications of various models. It wasn't just about finding the most luxurious option. He needed something practical, something that would meet the demands of his hectic schedule. He had to make sure that it could accommodate his team, the various people he worked with, and most importantly, be able to fly to all the communities he planned to visit. After much consideration, he chose a model that perfectly balanced comfort, technology, and functionality. It wasn't the flashiest jet out there, but it had everything he needed to reach his goals. It was spacious, with sleek, modern interiors, and equipped with cutting-edge technology. But more than that, it had the range to reach places that most commercial flights simply couldn't. The day Shaquille signed the papers to purchase the jet, he felt an immense sense of pride. It was a culmination of years of hard work, determination, and resilience. It wasn't just a personal milestone. It was a tool for creating change, for touching lives, and for amplifying his efforts to help others. His vision was beginning to take shape, and he was ready to take the next step. As the weeks passed, Shaquille eagerly prepared for the inaugural flight. His itinerary was packed with trips to various communities where he had ongoing projects. He imagined the people he would meet, the lives he would change, and the impact he would make. Every detail of the jet was tailored to ensure that it would serve as a bridge between him and the causes that mattered most. But what he didn't know was that this journey, this dream that had ignited his passion, would soon be tested in ways he could never have anticipated. The first flight would bring challenges that would shake him to his core, testing his resolve and forcing him to confront a harsh reality he hadn't expected. This was just the beginning, but it would be a beginning filled with unexpected twists that would alter everything. The unexpected obstacle. The day of Shaquille O'Neal's inaugural flight arrived with the kind of excitement that comes with the start of something new. The sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, casting long rays across the private airstrip where his jet stood ready, gleaming in the morning light. The plane, sleek and immaculate, felt like an extension of his ambition, something that had been years in the making. Shaquille had arrived early, his anticipation palpable as he walked toward the jet. This was his moment, a moment of triumph, the first flight in the jet that would help him reach the communities, causes, and dreams he had always aspired to. His entourage was already busy preparing for the trip. Crew members worked with precision, ensuring everything was in order. Technicians scurried around, making last-minute adjustments to the aircraft. The smell of fresh-cut grass mingled with the unmistakable scent of aviation fuel, and the hum of activity was almost soothing. Shaquille walked across the tarmac, his mind focused on the mission ahead. There was no doubt in his mind that this would be the start of something much bigger. But just as Shaquille was about to step onto the jet, a voice rang out from behind him. "Hey you, hold it right there." Shaquille turned around, his brow furrowed in confusion. A security guard, tall and broad-shouldered, was approaching him with a stern expression. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, but there was something in his eyes, something that felt wrong. Shaquille stopped in his tracks, not sure what to expect. The air felt suddenly charged with tension. The security guard walked closer, not making any attempt to smile or offer an explanation. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked, his tone hostile. "This is a private airstrip. You're not supposed to be here." Shaquille took a moment to process the guard's words. Was this a joke? He had been given permission to fly, his flight details had been cleared, and he had already shown up early to ensure everything was ready. Confusion mixed with irritation. "I'm here for my flight," Shaquille said, his voice calm but firm. He gestured toward the jet behind him. "That's my plane." The guard didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a loud, dismissive laugh, more of a sharp bark than anything remotely humorous. "Your plane. That's rich. Let's see some ID," he said, his eyes narrowing as he sized Shaquille up. Shaquille's patience was beginning to wear thin, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out his driver's license and a laminated card verifying his ownership of the aircraft. He handed them over without hesitation, but the guard snatched them from his hand, his eyes darting from the documents to Shaquille's face. The scrutiny was uncomfortable, and Shaquille could feel the guard's hostility in every movement. "This doesn't look right," the guard muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he continued to examine the documents. "I don't believe this." He looked up at Shaquille again, his face twisted with suspicion. "How exactly did you afford a plane like that?" The words stung, cutting deeper than Shaquille cared to admit. He had encountered prejudice before. Most people had, but it always hit hard, no matter how many times it happened. In that moment, standing face to face with a man who doubted his success simply because of the color of his skin, it felt like all the years of struggle had suddenly come crashing back. "I worked for it," Shaquille replied, his voice steady but laced with an edge of frustration. "Now, if you're done, I'd like to get to my flight." The guard didn't back down. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice lowering but still dripping with hostility. "Look, buddy, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I've seen this before. You don't belong here." The insult was clear, and Shaquille felt his anger begin to rise. His imposing figure, standing at over 7 feet tall, was now towering over the guard. But he kept his voice calm, refusing to let his temper take over. "I don't know what you think you've seen, but this is no scam. I own that plane, and I have every right to be here." The guard's face hardened as he crossed his arms. "We'll see about that," he muttered, and with a swift movement, he pulled a radio from his belt. Before Shaquille could respond, the guard was calling in backup, his voice sharp and accusatory. Shaquille stood there, his mind racing. The entire situation felt surreal. This wasn't supposed to happen. Today was supposed to be a celebration. It was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter, not this humiliating confrontation. The eyes of the crew were on him, but they stood at a distance, unsure of how to react. Some seemed to exchange glances, while others continued to work, but the tension was palpable. Within minutes, 2 police cars screeched to a halt on the tarmac. The flashing lights added a surreal touch to the already uncomfortable scene, as 4 officers stepped out of the cars. Shaquille's stomach tightened, the familiar sting of being judged based on his appearance surfacing once again. The guard quickly approached the officers, gesturing toward Shaquille with an exaggerated motion, as if he had caught a criminal in the act. The officers listened carefully as the guard spoke animatedly, recounting the situation. Shaquille stood by, his arms crossed, trying to keep his composure, though he felt the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The entire situation felt like a nightmare. One of the officers turned to Shaquille and spoke, his tone firm but measured. "Sir, we're going to need to see your identification and proof of ownership for the aircraft," the officer said, his eyes scanning Shaquille's face. Shaquille handed over his documents again, this time making a conscious effort to stay calm. He had been in tense situations before, on and off the court, but this was different. The officer took the documents and examined them closely, his brow furrowing as if unsure. "These look legitimate," the officer muttered, still skeptical, "but we'll need to verify everything. Understand?" Shaquille nodded, though frustration swirled in his chest. "I understand, but this is unnecessary. Everything you need is right there." The verification process dragged on, the minutes ticking by slowly as Shaquille stood in silence. His eyes stayed locked on the officers and the guard, whose expression had shifted to one of smug satisfaction. The crew had dispersed, leaving Shaquille to face the situation alone. As the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, Shaquille's frustration began to boil over. Memories of his past flooded his mind. The times when he had been underestimated, rejected, or outright insulted because of his background. This wasn't just about today or this specific incident. This was about the lifetime of judgment and bias he had faced, and now it felt like all of that was coming to a head. How many times had people questioned his right to success? How many times had he been forced to prove himself, despite the mountains of evidence in his favor? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers approached him, holding the documents. "Everything checks out. You're free to go," the officer said, his tone clipped, as if he was reluctant to admit that the guard had been wrong. Shaquille took the papers and glanced at the officer. "That's it? No apology? No recognition that I've been treated unfairly? That my time has been wasted?" The officer hesitated, looking back at the guard. Before he could respond, the guard spoke up, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, we were just doing our job. You should be glad we're thorough." Shaquille's temper flared. "Thorough?" he snapped, his voice rising. "This wasn't thorough. This was profiling, plain and simple. You made assumptions based on how I look, not who I am." The guard's smug expression faded, but he didn't say anything. The officers exchanged uneasy glances before turning back toward their cars. As the vehicles drove off, Shaquille turned back toward the jet, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He was shaken, but he wasn't going to let this moment define him. The experience had stolen some of the joy he had been feeling about the new chapter in his life. What should have been a triumphant moment now felt tarnished. The dream of flying high in his own jet had been marred by the bitter reality of prejudice. As Shaquille boarded the plane, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a much larger issue, one that Shaquille knew he couldn't ignore. Reflections at 30,000 feet. As the engines of the jet roared to life, Shaquille O'Neal leaned back in his seat, staring out the window with an intensity that belied the calm exterior he tried to maintain. The sprawling city below seemed to shrink as the plane ascended, the once bustling streets now just a patchwork of life and movement. The turbulence of the morning, both physical and emotional, hadn't yet subsided, and the vast skies stretched before him, offering no escape from the turmoil that churned in his mind. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. What should have been a moment of pure joy, the first flight in his new private jet, had turned into a bitter reminder of the obstacles he had spent his entire life fighting. The earlier confrontation with the security guard had caught him off guard. Despite all the success, all the achievements, there it was again: prejudice, suspicion, and doubt. Not because of who he was or what he had accomplished, but because of how he looked. The realization stung more deeply than Shaquille cared to admit, and it wasn't just about that one encounter. It was the culmination of every moment in his life where he had been judged, overlooked, or dismissed because of his race. He had learned to rise above these moments before, but this time felt different. This time, it wasn't just about him. As the jet climbed higher, the air around him grew cooler. Shaquille closed his eyes for a moment, letting the vibrations of the plane settle beneath him, hoping it would settle his racing thoughts. He thought back to his childhood, his modest beginnings in Newark, New Jersey, where his dreams felt so far out of reach. He remembered the basketball courts, the practice sessions, the late nights spent perfecting his skills. He remembered the people who had doubted him, the coaches who thought he was too tall to be a star, the teachers who thought his big dreams were nothing more than childhood fantasies. But he proved them all wrong. Shaquille O'Neal had become a global icon. He was one of the greatest basketball players the world had ever seen, and along the way, he built an empire. He had defied the odds, pushed past the barriers that tried to keep him down. He had become a beacon of hope, showing others that with enough hard work, persistence, and belief in yourself, anything was possible. So why did it still feel like he was fighting for validation? The hours on the flight stretched before him, and in the quiet of the cabin, Shaquille let his mind wander back to the moment at the airstrip. He had done everything right. He had gone through the proper channels. His ownership of the jet had been verified. The officers had confirmed his identity. But none of that mattered to the security guard who had looked at him with suspicion simply because he didn't fit the image of who belonged at such a prestigious airstrip. The smirk on the guard's face had haunted him, even now. It wasn't just the words the man had spoken, it was the look in his eyes, the way he had dismissed Shaquille without a second thought. And when the officers had arrived, it was clear that they were more inclined to believe the guard than Shaquille. Despite the documents, despite the proof, there had been an air of doubt surrounding him. It was as if, in their minds, the only way he could afford such a jet was through something underhanded. And then the worst part, the sense that it wasn't just the guard who doubted him. It was the system. A system that would look at someone like Shaquille O'Neal, successful, wealthy, and accomplished, and still see him as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. That realization hit harder than any criticism or challenge he had ever faced. The thought of his younger self, the teenager with big dreams and even bigger doubts, stirred something deep inside of him. That moment in high school when he had been laughed at for dreaming of becoming a basketball star. How many times had people told him that his dreams were too big, too far-fetched? How many times had he been dismissed simply because of his background? And yet he had persevered. He had become a legend. So why, after all these years, did it still feel like he was fighting that same battle? Shaquille's mind drifted to the communities he was about to visit. The whole purpose of this jet, the whole reason he had invested in it, wasn't about the luxury or the glamour. It was about reaching people, reaching communities that needed help, places where resources were scarce, where dreams were stifled by circumstances. He had envisioned this plane as a vehicle for good, a tool that would allow him to make a real impact in the lives of people who needed it most. But now, as he soared through the clouds, Shaquille couldn't help but wonder if his very presence, his identity, was going to get in the way of that mission. How many other people would look at him, at his success, and think he didn't belong? How many people would question his right to be where he was, to do what he was doing? "Shaq, you okay?" Laura's voice cut through the heavy silence in the cabin, her tone soft yet full of concern. She had been with him through many high-pressure moments, but this was different. She could see the weight of the day pressing down on him. Shaquille turned to her, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah," he said, though it was clear that he was far from fine. "Just thinking." Laura set her tablet down and shifted in her seat, her eyes locking onto his. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said gently. "I know that was rough back there. I saw how it affected you. You don't have to shoulder it alone." Shaquille appreciated her words, but the truth was, he wasn't sure how to share what he was feeling. It wasn't just anger or frustration. It was a deep sense of disillusionment. For all his accomplishments, all his good work, there was still this undercurrent of disbelief. People still questioned whether he deserved it, whether someone who looked like him belonged in places like this, on a private airstrip, boarding a personal jet, headed to change the world. "You know, I've been through a lot," Shaquille said, his voice quieter now. "I've been doubted, dismissed, underestimated, pretty much my whole life. But this, it just feels different. It's not just about me anymore. It's about everyone who has ever had to fight this battle, who's been told they don't belong, who's been looked at like they don't deserve success." Laura nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "You've worked hard for everything you have, Shaq. Everything. You've earned it. The jet, your success, everything you've done for others. It's all because of you. It's not about how you look. It's about who you are." Shaquille exhaled slowly, letting the words settle. He knew she was right. But in that moment, it felt like the world didn't see it that way. The world saw a giant, physically, yes, but also as a symbol of something people were uncomfortable with. A man who didn't fit the mold. A man who had overcome the odds, but who was still fighting for acceptance. As the jet cruised on, Shaquille's mind turned to how he would respond. What was the right course of action? Should he let the incident slide, focus on the mission ahead, and push forward with the work he had always done? Or was this something that needed to be confronted? This lingering sense of exclusion, this subtle but pervasive prejudice. "I can't just let this go, Laura," he said after a moment. "It's not just about me. It's about everyone who's ever had to fight for their place, for their right to succeed. I can't let this be another one of those moments where we just accept the way things are." Laura gave him a small, understanding smile. "I knew you'd say that," she said, her tone filled with quiet admiration. "But you're not alone in this. You never have been." As the plane continued its flight toward the first of many communities he hoped to visit, Shaquille made a quiet promise to himself. This wouldn't just be a story of personal triumph. This would be a journey. A mission to make sure that everyone, no matter their background, had a fair chance to dream, to reach, to rise above. The skies ahead were clear, but for the first time, Shaquille realized that the real work, the real fight, wasn't going to be in the air. It was going to be on the ground. The power of words. The sound of the jet's engines hummed steadily beneath Shaquille O'Neal, filling the cabin with a low, comforting vibration as the miles of sky stretched before him. Yet, as serene as the flight was, the chaos of his thoughts refused to quiet. The image of the security guard's sneering face haunted him. No matter how far he had come, no matter how many milestones he had achieved, it was moments like this that made him question whether the world had truly accepted him, or if he was simply tolerated in spaces where he had earned his place. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a golden glow across the clouds. Outside, the view was breathtaking, but inside the cabin, Shaquille's mind was still spinning, trying to make sense of it all. Laura, sitting across from him, seemed to sense the shift in his mood, though she remained quiet, giving him the space he needed. But Shaquille couldn't remain silent for much longer. The events of that morning, the words of the guard, the doubts that had followed him through his life, there was a weight on his chest that wouldn't go away until he addressed it. "Laura," Shaquille said, his voice quiet but resolute, "I've been thinking about what happened, and I think I need to do something about it. About all of it. It's not just about me. It's bigger than that." Laura put her tablet down, her eyes meeting his, filled with understanding. "I thought you'd say that. What are you thinking?" Shaquille stared out the window, his gaze distant, as though searching for the words in the shifting clouds below. He had been through so many battles in his life, on the court, in business, in his personal journey. But this was different. This wasn't something he could just move past. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of something much larger. A system that still saw people like him as less than, no matter how much success they achieved. "I've been blessed in so many ways," he began slowly, his voice thoughtful. "But this is something I didn't expect. I thought that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself, if I reached the pinnacle of success, then I would finally get to a place where I could be treated like everyone else. But this morning proved that no matter where you are, there's still a part of the world that's going to see you for what you look like, not for what you've earned." Laura nodded, her eyes reflecting the same fire that burned in Shaquille's heart. "That's not just your fight, Shaq. It's everyone's. There are so many people out there, struggling for the same acceptance, for the same opportunities. They need someone who can show them that it's not about fitting into someone else's mold, it's about breaking it." Shaquille exhaled, feeling the weight of her words settle into his bones. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about giving a voice to the millions of people who faced the same prejudices, the same doubts, the same struggles that he had faced growing up. He had come so far, yet there were still walls standing between him and the world he believed he could change. For years, Shaquille had been known for his larger-than-life personality. He was a giant on the basketball court, a man whose charisma could fill a room, whose voice could command attention. But now he realized he could use that same power to speak up for those who weren't in a position to fight for themselves. The words he used, the stories he shared, had the power to change minds, to shift perspectives. He knew the importance of using his platform, not just to show people how successful he had become, but to show them what was possible for everyone. "What if I used my platform for something more?" he continued, his voice growing more passionate. "What if I used my voice to speak out? Not just for me, but for all the people who are treated the way I was this morning, like they don't belong, like they don't deserve what they've earned." Laura leaned forward, her eyes lighting up with the same energy that had sparked in him. "Shaq, I think that's exactly what you need to do. You've always said you wanted to make a difference, to use your success to help others. This is your chance." Shaquille nodded slowly, the realization dawning on him. The jet, the success, the fame, it all meant something. But it meant nothing if he wasn't using it to push for real change. And change didn't come from just winning championships or building businesses. It came from using your voice, your influence, to raise awareness and challenge the systems that needed to be broken down. The rest of the flight passed in a haze of thoughts and ideas. Shaquille spent the time reflecting on how he could turn his feelings of anger and frustration into something productive. He knew he couldn't just ignore the hurt of the morning, but he also knew that he didn't have to let it define him. He could use it as fuel for action. By the time the plane began its descent toward the first community on his itinerary, Shaquille had made up his mind. He would not let this incident slip into the background. He would speak out, publicly, clearly, and unapologetically. He would make a statement, not just about the incident with the security guard, but about the systemic prejudices that still shaped the way the world viewed people of color, especially successful ones. As the jet touched down and rolled to a stop, Shaquille felt a sense of resolve that he hadn't felt before. He wasn't just here to visit a few schools and communities. He was here to make a statement, to lead a conversation that needed to happen. The ground crew was already waiting, along with a few local organizers who had been anxiously anticipating his arrival. As Shaquille stepped off the jet, the cool air of the small town greeted him, and the group of children that had gathered to see him cheered excitedly, their faces full of joy and hope. Shaquille smiled, taking a moment to let their enthusiasm lift his spirits. These were the people he was doing this for. These were the communities that needed his help, that needed to see that dreams weren't just for some, they were for everyone. But even as he engaged with the children, as he knelt to listen to their stories and dreams, the words of the guard, the judgment in his voice, echoed in the back of his mind. He knew that many of these children, and countless others like them, faced similar battles. They were raised in circumstances that often told them their dreams were impossible, that their futures were already determined by the zip code they were born in or the color of their skin. It was his job now to tell them that they could rise above that, to show them that anything was possible, no matter where they came from. Later, as the event came to a close and the crowd dispersed, Shaquille found a quiet moment to step away from the hustle and bustle. He pulled out his phone and began typing. It was time. He didn't need to plan a grand speech. He didn't need to spend hours crafting the perfect message. This was about honesty, about truth, about speaking from the heart. The video he posted that evening wasn't just for his followers. It wasn't just a call for support. It was a message to the world. Today was supposed to be a celebration. He began in the video, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The first flight in my new jet, a symbol of everything I've worked for. But instead, I was met with doubt and suspicion, not because of anything I did, but because of who I am. This is bigger than me. It's about all of us who face judgment based on how we look or where we come from. It's time to have the conversation, to challenge the assumptions, and to demand better. The video ended with a promise, a vow that this moment, this struggle, would not be in vain. He would continue fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who faced this same battle. As the video uploaded and began to spread, Shaquille felt a shift inside of him. The hurt was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He had turned it into something powerful, something that could spark change. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The ripple effect. Shaquille O'Neal sat in the back of his car, the steady hum of the engine beneath him barely registering. His mind was racing, still processing the whirlwind of emotions that had led him to post that video. As he glanced out the window, watching the world move by, it was clear that something inside him had shifted. The familiar sense of frustration and anger that had gnawed at him since the confrontation with the security guard was no longer in control. Now something more powerful had taken its place. Resolve. As the car pulled up to his next destination, a large community center on the outskirts of another city, Shaquille couldn't help but reflect on how this day had already been unlike any other. He had spent hours speaking to children, meeting with local leaders, and visiting schools where dreams were made and broken. And yet, in the back of his mind, his thoughts kept returning to the response his video had already started to garner. He had expected pushback, people who didn't want to hear about racism, or who would dismiss his experience as an isolated incident. But what he had found was the exact opposite. His video had gone viral almost immediately, spreading across social media like wildfire. The comments poured in from all corners of the globe. Support, solidarity, and most surprisingly, people sharing their own stories of similar experiences. For the first time in his life, Shaquille realized that he wasn't alone in this fight. The video wasn't just a statement about his own mistreatment. It was a rallying cry for everyone who had been subjected to prejudice and discrimination, who had felt the sting of being judged based on the color of their skin, their name, or where they came from. Shaquille had never been one to back down from a challenge. But this was different. The outpouring of emotion from people who identified with his story, who had lived through their own versions of it, was both humbling and empowering. It was as if his decision to speak up had cracked open a dam of untold stories, flooding the world with shared experiences of racism, exclusion, and prejudice. As he entered the community center, the warm reception of the local leaders and volunteers did little to distract him from the overwhelming surge of emotion he was still processing. The kids he'd met earlier had smiled at him, their faces glowing with excitement at the prospect of meeting someone they admired, someone they looked up to. But now, it was his turn to give them something of real value, something that went beyond just being a role model on a basketball court. He needed to show them how they, too, could rise above the obstacles in their way, how they could take on the world with the same tenacity that had gotten him to where he was. The event itself was a whirlwind of activity. Shaquille took the stage, the crowd's excitement palpable. Yet, as he looked out over the sea of faces, many of them young, eager, and full of hope, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at stake here. It wasn't just about inspiring them to work hard and chase their dreams. It was about showing them that their dreams were valid, that their voices, their struggles, and their futures mattered just as much as anyone else's. But as he spoke, something unexpected happened. A moment that would go on to become a pivotal turning point in the journey he was beginning to take. As Shaquille addressed the crowd, he began to notice a series of subtle exchanges, whispers, glances, and even a few nods from the crowd. It was only after his speech ended and the event moved into a more casual setting that one of the local organizers, a woman named Clara, approached him with a deep, serious look in her eyes. "Shock," she began, her voice soft but filled with urgency. "I don't think you realize the impact you've had with your video. People are reaching out, students, teachers, even people from other cities. They want to hear more from you. They need to hear more from you." Shaquille raised an eyebrow, surprised by the intensity in Clara's tone. "I thought it was just something I needed to do for myself, to speak out and make a statement." Clara shook her head. "It's more than that now. You've tapped into something bigger, something that people have been afraid to talk about for too long. You have the power to create real change, to bring people together. You're not just a voice for the voiceless anymore. Shaq, you're a movement. The weight of her words hit Shaquille harder than anything he had experienced that day. The video, which had started as a personal response to an injustice he'd faced, had now become a catalyst for something larger than he could have imagined. People were listening, and they were demanding more than just words. They wanted action. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of discussions, interviews, and conversations with community leaders, but Shaquille's mind was already working overtime. He had always been a man of action, driven by the belief that true change didn't come from waiting around. It came from taking charge and challenging the system. He had a platform, he had a voice, and he had the power to make a real difference. The question was no longer if he would continue his fight for justice. The question was how far he was willing to take it. When he returned to his hotel that evening, Shaquille sat down with his phone, scrolling through the hundreds of messages and comments that had flooded his social media. It was a humbling experience. Messages from athletes, actors, politicians, and everyday people who had been affected by racial profiling, discrimination, and injustice. Stories from people who had faced the same obstacles, the same treatment, and yet had still managed to push forward. It was clear to him now. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was the fight of everyone who had ever been made to feel inferior because of their race, their background, or their identity. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Shaquille found himself becoming more and more involved in the conversation around race and social justice. He began working with organizations dedicated to addressing systemic racism, giving speeches, and engaging with local communities. But he didn't stop there. He took his message to the basketball court, using his platform as an NBA legend to reach an even wider audience. During a live interview with a national sports network, Shaquille spoke out against the kind of racial profiling he had faced, calling for change not only within the world of sports, but within society as a whole. His words were firm, but the conviction in his voice was what resonated the most. He wasn't just talking about what had happened to him. He was talking about the broader implications of a system that continued to marginalize certain groups of people. The impact was immediate. News outlets picked up on his statements, and soon, athletes from other sports, football, baseball, tennis, and beyond, began to rally around him. They shared their own stories, their own struggles with racism and prejudice. Together, they were creating a movement, one that couldn't be ignored. Shaquille's message had become a call to action, not just for those who had been affected by racism, but for everyone who had the power to change it. It wasn't about waiting for things to improve on their own. It was about actively working to dismantle the systems that perpetuated inequality, about creating opportunities for people who had been historically excluded from the conversation. As the weeks passed, Shaquille began to see real change. Laws were being re-examined. Communities were coming together to challenge the biases that still held them back, and businesses began to take a closer look at their diversity and inclusion policies. The ripple effect of Shaquille's video had sparked a fire that couldn't be extinguished. And for Shaquille, this was only the beginning. The fight was far from over, but he was no longer fighting alone. He had become part of something bigger, something that was destined to change the world for the better. Through his own pain, he had found the strength to give a voice to those who needed it most. And that, he realized, was the ultimate victory. A legacy of change. The months following Shaquille O'Neal's viral video were nothing short of transformative. What had started as a single act of speaking out against racial prejudice had turned into a movement, one that reached across social boundaries, touched lives, and opened doors to critical conversations that had long been ignored. Shaquille had set out on a journey to challenge not just the way he was perceived, but the very system that allowed such discrimination to persist. As he continued his travels, visiting schools, community centers, and meeting with local activists, it became clear that Shaquille's mission had grown beyond his personal crusade. His words, his actions, and his platform were now the foundation of something much larger, a catalyst for change. People from all walks of life, from athletes to business owners, from students to politicians, were rallying together to amplify the message. The hashtag We Are More Than Our Skin was trending worldwide, a reminder that identity and success should not be limited by the stereotypes society often imposed. The journey wasn't easy, and Shaquille knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges. There were moments when it felt like the weight of the world was pressing on him. There were setbacks, moments when the negative voices, those who didn't want to see change, grew louder. But the determination that had fueled him throughout his life, the same determination that had driven him to become a champion on the basketball court, was now focused on making sure that his fight for justice didn't end with one viral video. As Shaquille entered his hotel room one evening after another long day of speaking engagements, he let out a heavy sigh. The exhaustion was palpable, but his purpose was clear. It was all worth it. He'd received hundreds of letters, messages, and phone calls from people whose lives had been impacted by his message. One letter in particular stood out. A handwritten note from a young man named Malik, a high school senior from a small town who had always dreamed of becoming an architect, but had been told by his teachers that his background, his race, and the challenges he faced growing up would prevent him from ever succeeding in the field. In his letter, Malik thanked Shaquille for speaking up, for reminding him that he wasn't bound by the limitations others tried to impose on him. Shaquille's words had given him the courage to apply to architecture school, and he had already been accepted. The letter made Shaquille pause, reflecting on the profound impact his journey was having, not just on the communities he visited, but on the individuals whose lives were being altered by a simple act of speaking the truth. It was these stories that reminded him of the importance of this fight. Every victory, no matter how small, was a step toward dismantling the prejudices that held so many people back. But it wasn't just the people he was meeting that made this journey significant. It was the change that was starting to take root in institutions, in businesses, and in the very fabric of society. A number of large companies had approached him, wanting to work together to implement more inclusive hiring practices, build diversity programs, and address racial inequities in the workplace. He had joined forces with nonprofits dedicated to supporting underrepresented communities and had begun to help fund scholarships for young people who wanted to pursue careers in fields like technology, engineering, and medicine, fields that had traditionally seen little diversity. Shaquille's jet, once a symbol of his personal success, had transformed into something much greater, a vehicle for progress. It wasn't just a tool to get him from one city to the next. It was now a symbol of his commitment to making a difference. He used the jet to visit communities in need, to bring resources, to host motivational workshops, and to hold meetings with leaders and influencers who could help move the needle forward. It was a testament to the fact that success should never be an end in itself, but rather a means to create more opportunities, to break down barriers, and to give people the tools they needed to succeed. But no matter how much success he had found, Shaquille understood that the work was far from over. As he reflected on the progress that had been made, he was reminded of the deep-rooted issues that still persisted. Racial inequality was still pervasive in every aspect of life, from education to healthcare to the criminal justice system. The system that had once tried to hold him back was still holding back millions of others. And though the conversations were happening, though change was slowly being driven, Shaquille knew it would take years, even decades, for true equity to be achieved. One evening, Shaquille found himself in the quiet of his hotel room once again. But this time, his thoughts were not on the next speech or the next community he was about to visit. He was thinking about the next generation, the kids he had met at various events, the young people who had been inspired by his words and who now wanted to make their own mark on the world. What kind of world would they inherit? Would it be one where they could thrive, unencumbered by the biases and stereotypes that had followed so many of his peers throughout their lives? That night, as he sat on the balcony of his room overlooking a quiet cityscape, Shaquille made a decision. It was time to shift his focus, to build something sustainable that would outlast his own efforts and continue the work of dismantling racial inequities for generations to come. He began to sketch out a plan for a new foundation, one dedicated to education, empowerment, and advocacy for young people in underserved communities. A foundation that would focus on providing scholarships, mentorship, and resources to help the next generation reach their fullest potential, no matter their background or circumstances. Shaquille knew that this foundation, with its emphasis on empowerment through education and opportunity, could be the legacy he left behind. A legacy that went beyond the basketball courts and beyond his years in the spotlight. This was the real work, the kind of work that would ensure that no child, regardless of where they came from, was ever made to feel like their dreams were too big. That no one would ever be told they didn't belong in a place just because of their race or their background. As he got to work on creating the foundation, Shaquille knew it was the right next step. His platform had given him the voice to ignite change, but now it was time to build the infrastructure that could sustain that change long after he was gone. The idea was to not only fund education, but to create a network of mentors, leaders, and activists who could provide guidance and inspiration to young people. It was time to turn his pain and his story into something tangible that could help create a more just and equal society for future generations. Months later, as the foundation took shape, Shaquille stood at its launch event, surrounded by hundreds of supporters, partners, and young people who were excited about the possibilities that lay ahead. The air was filled with optimism and determination, and Shaquille could see the future in the faces of the young people who had come to the event. These were the future leaders, the dreamers, and the change makers. And through the work of his foundation, they would have the tools they needed to reach their goals. Tonight, Shaquille said, addressing the crowd, "We are not just celebrating the launch of a foundation. We are celebrating a future where every child, regardless of where they come from, has the opportunity to reach their fullest potential. A future where we don't just talk about change, but we make it happen. And this is just the beginning." Shaquille O'Neal's legacy was no longer defined by his basketball achievements, but by the lives he touched, the doors he opened, and the world he was helping to create. One where opportunity was no longer a privilege for the few, but a right for all.